Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel. Thank you for joining this live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the contrasting nature and indeed great difference, you could call it a gulf even, between the sort of heroes that Western school students were, at least during the time I was at school and before. And I'm talking from primary school onwards, even from kindergarten onwards, the sort of historical figures and heroes, icons, people to be held in reverence, that sort of thing throughout history. And it was based around real accomplishments. There wasn't much other than Christianity, and I'll come back to that in a minute, but other than Christianity, the people that were cited had real accomplishments. They were real people. Now, their accomplishments or achievements may have been, the rose-coloured glasses view may have been ginned up a little bit, but they were real people with real accomplishments that really did exist and really did those things and so on. Now, there was a heavy emphasis on the heroes of science, whether it be the people that had the guy that had invented the steam engine, or the spinning jenny for weaving fabric, back in the early days of the Industrial Revolution, or whatever it was. But going to Louis Pasteur, discovering germs, and all these sorts of things. So there was, on one side there was quite a heavy scientific emphasis. On the other side, there was the political heroes were two groups, I suppose, into two. Political heroes who had, or military heroes for that matter, who had defended the nation or the culture or the whatever, but they'd been in defense of something, and others who had corrected mistakes and anomalies of the past. So this was social progress was seen as, say, William Wilberforce, for example, an activist that wanted to end slavery. Say, William Wilberforce, for example, an activist that wanted to end slavery, or people that had sponsored new laws that had ensured the independence of the courts, and that the evidence would matter and people wouldn't be unfairly imprisoned or arrested or harassed by the state, and things like that. So improvements in, if you like, the overall organizational structure of the state, so it would produce outcomes that were fairer and more sensible and based on facts and so on. And of course, the scientific theory being facts, Charles Darwin, and the list goes on. So we were taught about those. Now, not that many years ago, there was one of those long weekend newspaper, like a crossword puzzle type thing, where they had all photographs or pictures of famous, well-known characters of history. Now, I remember I had one of those in the final year of primary school. So I'd have been, 10 years old or something. And I remember I knew them all. I got 100% out of them. I was, I suppose, an avid student of history and so on. But I knew them all, and they ranged from Julius Caesar and Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson, and others throughout history. And bear in mind, I was a white kid in a Western school. You learned about Western history as much as Chinese students would learn about Chinese history, and Japanese students about Japanese history, and so on. So unsurprisingly, that was the emphasis. So I remember getting them all, but in this with this crossword puzzle of the famous people, there was quite a much younger person there. So I gave it to them. But they didn't know anybody. They didn't know a single person on that. They couldn't identify any person. So there's not one hero or icon of Western history that this person knew about. So it's pretty clear that an investigations further reveal that they really stopped, the education system stopped teaching about Western heroes, whether it be accomplishments, Edison and the light bulb or something. It doesn't matter. They're not teaching about that anymore. They'll say that, well, Charles Dickens was really gay, or that Louis Pasteur, it was his black lesbian housekeeper that really did the work. They'll try and subvert the heroes, but the reverence and the sheer acknowledgement of their accomplishments, which could fall short of reverence, even that's not being taught anymore, and it's certainly not being taught or cast in any positive light. There's even stories that Charles Darwin really didn't do any of the work. He had some black taxidermist really did all the work. They come out with the most absurd things. That tearing down of Western heroes and so on. Actually, the first time I came across that was many years ago, when I came across the first gender studies student that I'd ever met, and I remember at the time I didn't even know that such a course of study could even exist. I mean, gender studies, you're kidding me, right? And she was quite open about it, that every Western hero, whether it be Louis Pasteur or Abraham Lincoln, or it doesn't matter, every one of them did not accomplish the things they supposedly did, and was a deeply flawed individual. They were a Nazi, or they were this, or a race, and so every one of them was hopelessly flawed from other reasons that seemed insanely fanciful to me. But she was quite on board with it. No, Charles Dickens was just a gay guy. He was a pedophile and others, and so on. So there was not one Western icon hero through history that withstood the withering scorn and attack of the gender studies thing. Now, at the time, it was stuck and confined into gender studies, but that same architecture of tearing down Western heroes, icons, people of clear and unambiguous accomplishment, that's now spread to every area of tertiary and even school study, so that it's now in cultural studies departments, law studies, for goodness sakes, legal studies. It's everywhere. Maybe pure maths or something might escape, but they've managed to infiltrate that into everything, which suggests that it was always they were trying it out. The incubator for that architecture of tearing down Western heroes was put into the gender studies department to prepare it and refine it and hone it, so it could go out and do its evil, noxious, poisonous business, which of course it is doing, and doing, by the way, with great success. They've been able to run around, excuse me, tearing down these Western icons with not the slightest bit of pushback. Now, I want to come back to this idea of the Western heroes were, again, all people of accomplishment. The guy that did the steam engine, or the spinning jenny, or all the scientific, or pretty much all the scientific accomplishments. 99% of all scientific accomplishments from the the 1700s onwards, even earlier than that, pretty much all occurred in the Western world. So it was the white Western people, pretty much all Christians, that achieved and accomplished these things. Not all, but primarily Protestant, by the way. So the West has a lot of heroes to talk about, and at school we did talk about them. We taught about them, and but again, it was real people, real things, real accomplishments, and of course, defaulting the scientific method. So outcomes that you can achieve through scientific method means that if you do the same, you can repeat the outcome, given the scientific basis, which means it must be based in fact. Then you can reproduce those. Thus, it can withstand the test of time. So 1 + 1 was 2. Whether it was Pythagoras that worked that out 2,000 years ago, or whether you do it today, that still holds up. I mean, it's not going to change. Whereas ideological attitudes, views, considerations, myths. They don't hold up to that sort of scrutiny, so they have to remain as myths and legends. Now, one thing I noticed when I started doing international business travel was, and I always was interested in looking at cultural things in other countries, like going to museums and places of cultural interest and so on. And I noticed that for the main part, not exclusively, but for the main part, they relied these other cultures, particularly the poorer the culture, or as in the poorer the nation, the GDP per capita type thing, how much they relied on seeing their history through the prism of myth and legend. And so, not that it wasn't evident in Western countries. You see the foundational myths, say, of Rome. So, say the original foundational myth of Rome, which is many thousands of years old. That it was founded by Romulus and Remus, who were raised by a pack of wolves or something like that. I think it was. Now the likelihood of that, of course, is likelihood of that being in any sort of reality is very slim indeed. But in terms of conveying a myth and myth, but it was seen as a myth. It wasn't seen as some sort of approximation of reality. And when I was again traveling around these other countries, they didn't have accomplishments of real people for the main, real people who are doing real things. Firstly, they had almost no scientific achievement, so there wasn't that. Many of them had no written history for thousands of years, and they were only acquired the capacity to write with when the Western people started arriving, or in some case, say in Asia, the written history was around for quite a while, but that wasn't the case, say, in Africa. So their accomplishments were, in a scientific sense, their modern history were almost non-existent because they had no accomplishments. Then going back further in time, there was the great kings of Persia, for example, the great King Darius and Xerxes and Cyrus and all this sort of thing. And these were, in their time, great kings of great empires, by the way. But those empires no longer existed. And given they conquered sort of adjacent areas and regions, and now were quite a small region compared to what Iran, for example, today is the nucleus of what the old Persian Empire once was. So they see the past through reminiscing about days long gone by, 1,000 years in the past, or through myth and legend, or a once great civilization and things like that, rather than seeing everything in the present, or anything in the present for that matter. And so this was something I noticed, that these cultures had no heroes or other than ones that were imagined or contrived. Now there are things like, say, heroes that don't really get a historical mention, and there are things that heroes, as I get older, I perceive heroes quite differently than I did as a 10-year-old kid, and unsurprisingly so. So say going to the witch trials in Salem, Massachusetts in the 1600s. Arthur Miller wrote a play about that called The Crucible, which is worth looking at, by the way. He comes at it very much from the perspective of an outsider Jewish guy. Arthur Miller was Jewish. So he brings that to the table, and you need to try and separate that. But in terms of historical sort of period of craziness that occurred, then that's it. But in the end, it was stopped because the chief legal officer in the state or the region, and off the top of my head, I can't remember his name, he came out and said, look, you've got to stop this, because he was quite local in the village of Salem. You've got to stop this craziness, because in order to convict these people, you have to be able to prove that they were in league with the devil. You can't do, I'm simplifying everything, but you can't do that unless you can call the devil to the witness stand to give evidence. Given that the devil isn't going to, pony up for the cross-examination, then you don't have the evidence to get these people in a court of law. And if you're going to go after them and imprison them or torture them, as they were doing, by the way, then you have to have evidence. And to have evidence, you must get it from the devil, because that's your source. Allegedly, these people are in some sort of conspiratorial arrangement with the devil. So if you can't bring the devil to the witness stand, then you can't prosecute these or put them in prison or torture them. So he shut it down, in effect. It's only because of him that was shut down. Now, he doesn't really get a mention in history, and I think he should have a statue in downtown. Maybe he does. I've been to Salem, Massachusetts, and walked around and gone to the witch museums and so on. I couldn't find a statue about this guy, but there should be one if there isn't. And so he is, I think, a hero. Not simply of that time and that place, but the way he defended due legal process. So I would rate him as a hero today. Now, I'm not sure that something as abstract as due legal process can really get a huge following in terms of perceiving its value in any society. But again, I would see that guy in a hero. Now, if you look at, say, you go to France, the heroes, there are heroes there such as Eiffel, who designed the Eiffel Tower, clearly, a great engineer, Louis Pasteur, and others in the scientific and or industrial space. But the two great heroes that seem to constantly come back for the top end of the reverence scale is Louis XIV, the Sun King, and partly because of his unification in effect of the centralization of authority of the French state, and of course Napoleon for his great military victories and the way he held the whole of Europe in sway and this sort of stuff. And and Napoleon in particular is considered with huge reverence. Now, what Napoleon may actually have accomplished, apart from the death of 2 million Frenchmen, what did he accomplish? But never before or since had France been held in such awe and respect and reverence and so on. So this is probably as much a thing. But if you look at the British heroes, and going to school in Australia, you had a British heavy sort of education system, and so Admiral Nelson, for example, for his naval victories, was seen as without those naval victories, England would have been invaded. Was the sort of the way that the history was taught. Or Alfred the Great, the English Anglo-Saxon king from the 800s, who managed to prevent the Danes from taking over all of England, and the Danish invaders who came. So the Vikings, or as they were generically known. So those were the sort of among the various heroes, but also political figures were touted as heroes, people who again had extended the voting, extended the franchise. So they were political heroes. But in all cases, these political heroes were seen as correcting a problem, correcting an anomaly, making something better than it was, and not just symbolically better, but actually better. And as in better organization, more efficient, greater functionality, those types of things. Now, this is something that outside of the West you don't see. Now, there are various things like, I don't know, Buddha or Confucius and things like that. But when you go looking for heroes, as in real material accomplishments and achievements, you don't find them outside of the West. And this is a very important part of the globalization project, is to destroy all Western heroes and icons, because then that creates this ridiculous, absurd, and very artificial type of equality. No one's better than anyone else, because we just killed off all the heroes that these guys had and pretend they don't exist. See, we're all equal. No, it's not how reality works. So the West's heroes, the Western heroes, had a closeness to and were a direct product of accomplishment and reality and achievement and identifiable, measurable, whereas heroes outside of that weren't. So I looked at some South American heroes, and that were supposed to have led revolutions and this sort of thing. And the way the view of reality is what can I say? Extremely broad, and the facts really don't matter. And again, you see this all across the rest, outside of the West. You see this all across the world. So my view is, or what I would posit is that because Western heroes and icons and historical figures have real accomplishments, real achievements, and real, that they produce real things and they're real people in their time, then we should revere them. And the fact that we can, they're able to be revered for their accomplishments, and again, being real people, then that makes the West very different from any other part of the world. And I think we need to come to grips with that and understand it and accept it and rejoice in it, I believe. Coming now to the religion side of it, religion obviously played a huge part as the Roman Empire collapsed. Then into that, if you like, into that vacuum, that void, Christianity sort of moved, and Christianity became the primary binding agent, if you like, across many European peoples, even though the whole of Europe had broken up into, this is Central and Western Europe, had broken up into petty kingdoms and petty principalities and dukedoms and so on, and it was religion primarily that held that together, or became the common, if you like, the common cultural currency of those places, rather than many different languages and customs and habits and so on. And I always like to point out that Rome, the eternal city that at its height in the Roman Empire had a population of more than 1 million, was reduced during the medieval times to a population of 30,000, where the great iconic imperial buildings of mighty imperial Rome were just overgrown with weeds, and had goat herders running their goats through these buildings, to the old Senate chambers and so on. I mean, an astonishing turnabout from what it was, but religion held that together. Now, whereas religious figures in other cultures, are obviously of myth. We can look at Jesus really did exist, and this is confirmed by historians of the time. Tacitus in the Annals for Imperial Rome as an example, and although the Romans perceived Jesus as more of a local troublemaker and an agitator and so on. The Romans are trying to keep the peace in a very fractious part of the world, fractious then and fractious now, a very fractious and difficult part of the world where unrest could just sprout out of the ground at the drop of a hat. And the Romans recognized this, and it's still the same today, 2,000 years later. So the Romans were very touchy and jumpy about anything that may possibly inflame local passions, and Jesus was seen as a possible risk in that area. So it was the histories that the Romans produced at least positioned or cast Jesus in that mold. But in terms of did Jesus exist? He did. That he was in there? He did. Was he murdered on the cross? Well, yes. And so all those things are facts. Whether Jesus was the Son of God, that you can debate. But the reality of his existence and the things he did. Now, the claims that, for example, he walked on water or cured the blind or something like that, then that again can be debated. Some of the things he supposedly did, that he without sin cast the first stone. maybe those things did, and they're more likely to have happened than the walking on water. Nonetheless, Jesus and his parables and so on, and given the times and how stories were communicated at the time, it was a parable for getting people to understand the morality of right and wrong and good and bad, given there weren't things like a police force or common law or courts in every town and so on. So there were different methods of trying to get people to not do bad things, whether it's robbing your neighbour or murdering people or something. There was that was how you communicated that. Whereas today there's the laws, and they're uniform laws, and then again police and courts and prosecutors and so on. But then they didn't have all that. So it was through religious instruction or guidance that people were convinced that this is the path of righteousness or otherwise. So the very different way of communicating and conveying messages. So but the reverence that Jesus was held in a point of communicating that morality, then I think that's pretty clear that religion and the case of Christianity, Jesus was really a focal point to that, and something was needed to transcend language, transcend areas, districts, cultures, and so on, and transcend all that and say, well, this is a common code of desirable behavior, and Christianity in turn played a huge role, I think, as the West started to colonize and just the big trading networks and so on, where that Christianity was introduced around the world, and with it came things that you didn't really see much outside of, things like the law courts, for example, did exist. You look at King Solomon and that sort of stuff. It did exist, but it didn't exist outside of a fabric of morality of which Christianity was a clear expression. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.